Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I would like to start my presentation with some general remarks on the Italian immigration to Australia, and saying that the image of Italian immigration to Australia is still anchored today to the post-World War II experience, namely to the government migration and labor policies and to the settlement of large cohorts of migrants from Europe. However, Italian immigration history should also recall the arrivals and settlements that occurred during the second half of the 19th century, from 1880s and so on, and particularly of the interwar period, even if numerically less significant than the flow after World War II. Scholars gave little attention to this initial migration phase, to its characteristics and composition, to the relationship between pre- and post-World War II flows. In fact, the current involvement of Italians in the Australian construction industry is a story that traces its origins back to the interwar period of the 1920s and 1930s, and possibly even earlier. It is argued that nearly all of the past and current Italian construction contractors in Melbourne and in Sydney began their entrepreneurial career by working for Italian terrazzo, marble, mosaic, and granulithic concrete companies established before World War II. What is terrazzo? Terrazzo is a very common type of stone and marble indoor flooring in Venice. The product is made up of grains of marble and stone of up to 40 millimeters in diameter that are bound together with limestone or cement, and for example right now with other material, other chemical material that is called epoxy, for example in the terrazzo, in the American terrazzo market. Craftsmen from the Friuli region in northeastern of Italy specialize in terrazzo floor as well as mosaic made of marble. Not so many Italians from Friuli were involved, for example, in the glass mosaic industry. Mosaic floors and terrazzo both require polishing, which was traditionally done by hand, using a special tool which consists of a piece of sandstone attached to a special iron with a long handle. The terrazzo can be seen as simpler than a mosaic floor, but it too is made with marble and pebbles of various colors. The art of terrazzo was practically the monopoly of craftsmen in the city-state of Venice since 16th century. In fact, the Terrazzo Guild was established in 1582, and the statutes of the Terrazzo Guild are kept in the Museo Correr in Venice. Importantly, almost all of these craftsmen in Venice came from the Alpine area of Friuli, especially from the towns of Sequal, Solimbergo, and nearby villages of Fanna, Cavasonuovo, Topo, Arba, and so on. This drawing depicts the terrazzo worker and was published in 17th century by Giovanni Gravenbroch's manuscript Gli abiti dei Veneziani, and at the beginning of the text it says that "Gli maestri propri e particolari dell'arte del terrazzieri sono per ordinario forlani." Masters involved in the terrazzo trades were ordinary from Friuli. They are Furlani from Friuli. And here you can see the geographical location of these small towns around Sequals and in the context of the northeastern Italy. Sequals and the nearby area, it was not so far from Venice. You can see also the capital region, Udine, or capital region of Friuli. And in the following map, you can see the area where many of these terrazzo workers came from in the Friuli region. The marble mosaic floor at the Block Arcade in Melbourne could be considered one of the first examples of marble mosaic art in the city. The Block Arcade, which was built between 1890 and 1893, had been modeled on the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele in Milan. And from people coming from overseas, I recommend to visit this marvelous building in 280 Collins Street in CBD Melbourne. The total cost of the Block Arcade was £46,000. That of today money is something like $5.3 million. And the 400 square mosaic floor cost was 700 pounds. Possibly the Block Arcade marble mosaic floor was executed by the Italian Marble Mosaic Company that was registered in 1892 and 1893 by Sons and McDougall Directory at 229 Collins Street. And it looks like the same company did the floors in St. Paul Cathedral in 1992 here in Melbourne. You can see here now some pictures of the Block Arcade floor in mosaic completed in early 1990s. This is a picture of the interior of the building, and this is some mosaic flooring in the St. Paul Cathedral, Melbourne. In 1898, so 5 years later, a report by the Italian consul in Melbourne, Pasquale Corti, recorded the presence of terrazzo and marble mosaic workers in the colony. Possibly they came from, added Pasquale Corti, possibly they came from the Friuli region near Venice in northeast Italy. And at the turn of the century, the Age newspaper published an article that referred to a mosaic worker, Giovanni Petrucco, a native of Venice, Italy, and the newspaper state that he and his brothers were the only ones in the state who did work of the kind. Actually, Giovanni Petrucco was not didn't come from Venice, but consulting the application for certificate of naturalization kept at the National Archives. He came from Cavasso Nuovo. He was born in 1875. He was a mosaic worker, and he arrived in Australia from Munich, Germany in 1903. In Melbourne, in late 1910s, the brothers Annibale and Severino De Marco created the terrazzo marble mosaic company, the Marco Brothers, which is considered one of the first firm in its type in the city. The De Marco brothers come from Friuli, from Fana, that is a small village very, very close to Cavasso Nuovo, where Petrucco was born. And they arrived in Australia before World War I. Annibale and Severino De Marco learned the trade by fellow countrymen entrepreneurs on war sites, first in Germany and then in London. Prior to coming to Melbourne, Annibale had worked for the Sydney-based company Melocco Brothers. Peter Melocco, the owner of the company in Sydney, who was trained as a marble mosaic worker through his uncles in New York City, arrived in Sydney in 1908 and established one of the most important Australian terrazzo companies at that time. In 1929, the De Marco brothers laid outstanding terrazzo floors in the foyer of the Regent Theatre and the Plaza Ballroom in Collins Street, Melbourne. You can see here some of the picture of the flooring executed in these two buildings in downtown Melbourne. And here you can see a glass mosaic completed by the DeMarco brothers in the newspaper house building in early 1930s. Here the other images. This is an ad published in the Vademecum degli Italiani in 1937 that at the DeMarco Brothers Company in Melbourne. When the DeMarco brothers arrived in Melbourne, they found that builders used English styles, and that little mosaic was required in the city, and that the terrazzo was virtually unknown. The building boom of the 1920s was pivotal for the company's growth. Terrazzo and scagliola work, an imitation marble made from keen cement, mostly used in banks and theatres, became the dominant activity of the DeMarco firm. In early 1920s, terrazzo overtook in popularity and became a fashionable flooring material for public buildings and apartment offices in the city, and I would say all around Australia. The introduction of the electric grinding machine around 1919 influences, as happened in the United States and in Germany too, the spread of terrazzo all over Australia. The DeMarco brothers sponsored many skilled Italians to come to Melbourne and to join their company. These Italian workers, coming mostly from Friuli, immigrated to Australia after learning the trade by fellow countrymen entrepreneurs on work sites outside Italy, mostly in Central Europe, mostly in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and so on. The early 1920s boom construction was a time of increased competition, with below cost tending to pick up available work. But the depression of the 1930s brought great hardship for the building, terrazzo, and concrete industry. In fact, during this year, many of Italian building workers involved in the terrazzo industry left the city to work, for example, in Gippsland area as woodcutters. Since late 1930s, terrazzo met the needs of the Art Deco styles, and its appeal lay in a relatively low cost combined with the potential to create colorful motif, as we can see here in these two terrazzo flooring in the Book Court building in Collins Street, Melbourne, executed in 1929. And this is a detail of the work of the flooring. In the interwar period, other Italian terrazzo and concrete firms were operating in Melbourne, as for example the Coloretti Company, the Adelaide Terrazzo Paving Company, the Federation Granolithic Company, the Milan or Milan Paving Company, and Simone Battistone will be speaking on this company later. The London Paving Company, the Anglo-Italian Granolithic Company. You can see here an ad from the Federation Granolithic Company, publishing the same book from the same Vademecum degli Italiani. The Genoa Terrazzo Company. Many Italian immigrants had worked for and learned the trade from these companies in the 1920s and 1930s, among whom the West known Luigi Grollo or Davide Barro, who established their own company after World War II. The post-World War II construction boom in Australia gave new impetus to the terrazzo, mostly concrete companies. Australia's industrial growth required many new factories with their concrete floors, and precast and in-situ terrazzo for hospitals and retail store and school, for example, was increasingly in demand. The tremendous growth in the construction industry drove many workmen to create their own business, as for example Davide Barro, who created the Barro's Paving Company, and Luigi Grollo, who created his own company soon after the Second World War. During the 1950s, a small number of companies commenced operating premix concrete plants. In 1953, Davide Barro introduced the first concrete agitator truck in Melbourne, but generally speaking, the supplying companies of cement, the blue metal type, and sand were separate from the companies working in the concrete industry. Here you can see one of the first agitator trucks that the Barro company, the Pronta company, actually used in early 1950s. The manufacturing of cement underlies the growth of the building and construction industry after World War II. Since the end of the World War II, the quantity of cement produced in Australia increased from 723,000 tons in 1945-1946 to nearly 3.7 million tons in 1965-1966. Ready-mix concrete production increased from 419 cubic yards in 1950-1941 to 6,600 cubic yards in 10 years later. The labor shortage in both terrazzo and concrete led many companies to source workers from Veneto, mostly from Veneto and Friuli regions in Italy. Italian and Australian construction entrepreneurs sponsored many fellow countrymen to come to Australia in the years that followed the end of World War II. Italian and Australian contractors could not find Anglo-Australians who were skilled in terrazzo or were willing to work in the concrete industry. Thus, skilled building workers had to be recruited from Italy, or Italian migrants had to be trained once in Australia. In the late 1960s, the building and construction industry directly employed over 400,000 persons, or 11% of the total male workforce. In the same period, there were some 4,000 individual building firms operating in Australia, mostly small and medium firms. In 1969, for example, a book published by the Italian Capuchin Church in Hosso, that this is a suburb of Melbourne, recorded at least 30 Veneti and Friulani immigrants running small building and construction companies. The nature of the construction industry means that at any time some small building firms were enjoying rapid expansion and growth. Conversely, other companies became not financially viable, and in some instances they left the industry or reverted to subcontraction. What can teach? What can we learn about this particular experience of the Italians in Australia, but also in other destination places as the United States or Canada or South Africa? Why does the study of the different migrant trades attract so little attention? Why are these trades not generally considered a migration heritage? Why is the legacy of migrant Italian worker skills in Australia overlooked? In fact, rarely do scholars deal explicitly with the relationship between migrants and their skills. And I consider this relationship a very important topic of the Italian immigration, not only to Australia. It is necessary to go beyond a stereotype image of the Italian migrants and unskilled workers. Trade skills should be considered an intangible heritage, and deserve significant attention and study for many reasons. The history of terrazzo and concrete workers represents a unique chapter of the story of Italian immigration to Australia. In fact, terrazzo companies in Australia originating from small-scale artisan craft, whose root, as we saw, dated back to 16th century Venice. And Friulani and Veneti immigrants brought about the diffusion in Australia of a typically Italian aesthetic and artisan art and craft in the 20th century. In fact, the introduction, development, and spread of terrazzo in Australia are to be credited to family-run companies, which were responsible for embellishing Australian buildings and architecture for almost a century. And importantly, they cater this small entrepreneur, they cater an artisan, they cater for the entire Australian community, and not only for the Italians. Just 2 minutes. This yet to be fully researched chapter of the Italian migration experience to Australia may represent a telling example on the strong relationship between certain Italian districts and townships in Friuli and Veneto, with some highly specialized occupation and between migration patterns and a trade. This experience also shows the circular migration experience. Many Italians, in fact, arrive in Australia after working in other countries, in the UK, in the United States, in Germany. So they didn't come directly from Italy. They were working somewhere else in Europe and overseas. This experience also shows that Italian marble, mosaic, and terrazzo and concrete workers entered the trade in Australia on the basis of their skills, which were historically imparted to workers from the Italian regions of Veneto and Friuli. In fact, the building trades, particularly terrazzo and cement line, had long been the principal avenues of employment for male Friulani and Veneti when they migrated over the Alps in Central Europe. And this experience also showed the strong links between Italian immigration flow to Australia occur in the interwar period and after World War II, and shows that we can approach the phenomena, the topic, with a long-term experience approach. Many of these entrepreneurs managed to remain and thrive within the trade due to their sought-after skills, but also to their entrepreneurial spirits, creativity, innovation, and willingness to adapt to new and emerging demands within the Australian constructed history. Thank you.